The Longhorns hit the tent line like a brown flood tearing through canvas, and Frank Fairchild came awake with his boots already moving before his mind had caught up to the roar. He burst out of the sheriff's office into a street gone mad. 3,000 head of Texas cattle, penned that morning at the rail yards of Ellsworth, Kansas, had broken through a weakened section of fence, and now they were pouring through the heart of town like the whole prairie had come loose and was rolling downhill. Dust rose in a wall taller than the buildings. Somewhere a woman screamed. A crate of dry goods exploded under a hoof and sent tin cans skittering across the boardwalk like startled quail. "Get inside! Get off the street!" Frank hollered, waving his arms at a drover's boy frozen near the corner of the Mercantile. He grabbed the kid by the collar and flung him bodily through the open door of the barber shop half a second before 600 pounds of terrified Texas beef thundered through the space where the boy had been standing. It was September of 1874, and Ellsworth was the wildest cattle town on the Kansas Pacific Line, a place where a man could make a fortune or lose his life before breakfast, and Frank Fairchild had worn the sheriff's star through most of it. He had seen drunken gunfights, knife fights over card games, and one particularly memorable brawl involving a Baptist preacher and a faro dealer. He had never seen anything move as fast or as blind as a spooked herd. He turned to look for more people to pull to safety, and that was when he saw her. Jane Monroe stood in the middle of the street outside her canvas-walled surgery, black bag already in hand, not running from the stampede but running toward a fallen railroad worker whose leg was pinned beneath an overturned freight wagon, directly in the herd's path. "Jane!" Frank's voice cracked across the noise, but she did not so much as turn her head. She never had, not for him, not in 2 years. He ran. The dust was so thick he could taste the copper tang of trampled earth, and the ground itself seemed to shudder with the approach of 1,000 hooves. Jane had already dropped to her knees beside the injured man, working at the wagon wheel with the strength of someone twice her size, trying to lever it off his crushed leg. "Get clear!" Frank shouted, reaching her in 3 long strides. "There is no time, doctor. Get clear now." "He will die if that leg is not freed," Jane snapped back, not even breathless, her sleeves already rolled to the elbow and her spectacles fogged with sweat and dust. "Help me lift, Sheriff, or get out of my way." There was no time to argue with her, and there never had been. Frank threw his shoulder under the wagon bed beside her, felt his boots dig into the churned dirt, and heaved. The wagon groaned, tilted, and the railroad worker's leg came free with a cry of pain that was swallowed by the deafening thunder now nearly on top of them. "Go, go, go!" Frank scooped the injured man up under the arms while Jane grabbed his legs, and together they staggered toward the narrow gap between the livery stable and a stack of lumber, diving through it just as the first wave of longhorns split around the obstacle like a river around a boulder. Dust and noise and the smell of hot animal fear engulfed them. Somewhere behind them a hitching post splintered like kindling. When the worst of it had passed, Frank found himself flat on his back in the narrow alley with Jane Monroe half sprawled across his chest, both of them coated head to toe in yellow dust, the injured railroad man groaning between them but alive. For one strange, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Jane's dark hair had come loose from its pins, hanging in a wild tangle around a face streaked with dirt and sweat, and her eyes, gray as a storm sky, were fixed on his with an expression he had not seen there in 2 years. Not defiance, not distance, something closer to relief. "You are a reckless man, Frank Fairchild," she said, her voice unsteady for the first time since the chaos began. "You are not exactly the picture of caution yourself, Dr. Monroe," he answered, and something in his chest, something that had gone cold and careful 2 years ago, cracked open just a little. She pushed herself up off him quickly, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly, and turned all her attention to her patient, as if the moment had not happened at all. But Frank had felt her heart hammering against his ribs, and he knew she had felt his. By the time the herd had been turned and scattered across the open prairie south of the rail yards, the town of Ellsworth looked as though a cannon had been fired down its main street. 2 buildings had collapsed. A dozen horses had bolted. Remarkably, no one had died, though 3 men, including the railroad worker, were laid up with broken bones, and Frank's own supply of ready-rolled bandages, kept in his office for exactly such emergencies, had been trampled into the mud along with most of Jane's medical stores, which had been sitting unguarded outside her tent when the herd came through. "Every bit of my quinine gone," Jane said later, standing amid the wreckage of her surgery, surveying broken bottles and scattered instruments with a weary kind of calm that told Frank she had faced worse losses than this. "My chloroform, my good scalpel, the one from Philadelphia. I will have to send to Kansas City for more, and that will take weeks." "I am sorry for it," Frank said, crouching to help her gather what could be salvaged. "The fence should have held. I told the Board of Trade last spring those pens needed reinforcing before the fall drives came through." "And did the Board of Trade listen to you, Sheriff?" "About as much as they listen to anyone who is not paying their bar tab." That drew a small, surprised laugh from her, quickly suppressed, but Frank caught it, and something in him warmed at the sound. He had forgotten, or tried to forget, how rare and how bright her laughter was. 2 years earlier, when Jane Monroe had first ridden into Ellsworth with a medical bag and a diploma from a college back east that most men in town did not believe existed, Frank Fairchild had been a newly appointed sheriff of 29, proud of his badge and lonelier than he liked to admit. He had watched her set a broken arm with more skill than the drunk excuse for a physician the town had employed before her, watched her ride out alone to homesteads no one else would visit, watched her face down a saloon full of armed men to demand they carry a wounded friend to her surgery, instead of letting him bleed out over a card table. He had fallen for her the way a man falls off a cliff, all at once and with no warning, and after 4 months of careful courting, of bringing her coffee on cold mornings and riding escort when she traveled to outlying ranches, he had asked her to marry him. She had said no, not cruelly. Jane Monroe was never cruel. But she had said no with a clarity that had cut him just the same, explaining in her calm, precise doctor's voice that a married woman could not practice medicine and keep her own name on her own diploma in the eyes of most territorial courts, could not travel where she pleased and treat whom she pleased without a husband's consent standing over every decision, and that she had fought too hard to become what she was to trade it for a wedding ring, however much she might otherwise wish things were different. That last part, however much she might otherwise wish things were different, had haunted him for 2 years. He had told himself it meant nothing. He had told himself a great many things. Now she was back in Ellsworth, older by 2 years and, if anything, more herself than ever, and Frank found the careful walls he had built around his heart were made of considerably less sturdy material than he had believed. The morning after the stampede, while the town was still clearing debris and counting its blessings, a stranger rode in on a lathered black gelding and asked for the sheriff. His name, he said, was Silas Judd, and he carried papers. Frank met him on the steps of the office, still bone-tired from a night spent helping repair the worst of the damage. Judd was a lean, sun-weathered man with pale eyes and the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to being obeyed, wearing a good coat that did not quite match the rest of him, like a man playing a part he had not fully learned. "I am here on behalf of Mr. Elias Whitfield of Independence, Missouri," Judd said, producing a folded document with a flourish. "Legal guardian and trustee of the estate of the late Charles Monroe. I have papers here requesting the assistance of local law in the matter of one Jane Monroe, currently residing in this town, who has been declared by 2 examining physicians to be of unsound mind and unfit to manage her own affairs." Frank did not take the papers immediately. Jane Monroe set a man's leg not 12 hours ago while 1,000 head of stampeding cattle bore down on both of them. That does not sound like a woman of unsound mind to me. Be that as it may, Sheriff, the law is the law, and Mr. Whitfield's petition is filed proper with the circuit court. He requests that Miss Monroe be detained pending a formal hearing on her competency, to take place within the month, here or in Salina, wherever a judge can be found to hear it. Until then, her father's estate, some 6,000 acres of grazing land along the Smoky Hill and considerable cattle proceeds besides, remains under Mr. Whitfield's sole trusteeship, as it has these 2 years since Charles Monroe passed. Frank finally took the papers and scanned them, his jaw tightening with every line. The language was thick with legal phrasing designed to sound unassailable, citing the testimony of physicians Frank had never heard of, describing behaviors, unwomanly conduct, disregard for personal safety, refusal to submit to proper male guidance, that sounded to Frank like nothing more than a list of the very qualities that made Jane Monroe the finest doctor he had ever known. "I will not arrest a woman for the crime of doing her job well," Frank said, handing the papers back. Judd's pale eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice remained pleasant. "I had a feeling you might say something along those lines, Sheriff. Mr. Whitfield anticipated as much. That is why he has already written to certain gentlemen here in Ellsworth, men who I understand had some hand in seeing you elected to that badge you wear. Men with considerable interest in a certain right of way the Kansas Pacific Railroad is hoping to purchase through the Monroe land, a purchase that becomes considerably simpler to arrange with Mr. Whitfield holding sole authority over the property than it would be dealing with a headstrong young woman who has, I am told, already refused 2 very generous offers." There it was. Frank felt the trap closing even as Judd smiled at him with the patience of a man who already knew how this would end. "I will need to speak with Miss Monroe before I do anything," Frank said finally. "Of course, Sheriff, take all the time you need. Just remember who signs your salary come election season." That afternoon, Cornelius Vance, president of the Ellsworth Board of Trade and the single largest cattle buyer in the county, along with Mayor Hollis Dunbar, called Frank into the back room of the Drover's Cottage Hotel for a conversation that left no doubt as to where their sympathies lay. "The railroad right-of-way through the old Monroe land is worth $40,000 to this town, Frank," Vance said, chewing the end of an unlit cigar. $40,000, spent right here in Ellsworth on grain elevators and stockyard improvements that will keep the cattle money flowing through this town for the next 20 years, instead of shifting west to Dodge City like everybody fears it will. Whitfield is prepared to sign that deal the day the courts confirm his authority. You want to be the man who stands in the way of that on account of some lady doctor's hurt feelings. It is not her hurt feelings I am concerned with, Cornelius. It is whether a man is trying to steal her inheritance by lying about her sanity. That is for a judge to decide, not you," Mayor Dunbar put in smoothly. "All we are asking, Frank, is that you not go stirring up trouble before the hearing. Keep the peace. That is your job, is it not?" Frank left the meeting with his stomach in a hard knot and went looking for Jane. He found her in the ruins of her surgery, sorting through the salvageable remains of her instruments by lamplight though the sun had not yet set, her movements sharp with barely suppressed anger. She had already heard about Judd and his papers. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Ellsworth. "2 examining physicians," she said without preamble when Frank stepped through the tent flap. "Do you know who they are, Frank? Dr. Amos Kellerman, whom I have never met in my life, and a Dr. Reginald Snow of Junction City, who I understand has never treated a patient in this state, and whose signature I strongly suspect was purchased along with his silence. Elias Whitfield has been trying to get his hands on my father's land since before my father was cold in the ground, and now that I am within 6 weeks of turning 28, the age at which my father's will says the trust dissolves entirely into my own name, he means to steal it out from under me with a stroke of a corrupt pen." "I believe you," Frank said quietly, and watched something in her shoulders loosen at those 3 simple words, as though she had expected to have to fight him too. "You believe me." I have watched you work for 2 years, Jane, on and off when your circuit brings you through here. I have seen you ride 40 miles in a snowstorm to set a child's arm and refuse payment from a family too poor to give it. I have seen you stare down men with guns without flinching. I do not need 2 hired doctors from Missouri to tell me whether you are sound of mind. I need about 10 seconds in a room with you. She looked at him for a long moment, and something vulnerable flickered behind her composed doctor's mask, something that made her look, for just a moment, less like the fearless physician of Ellsworth and more like a young woman who had lost her father and was now watching everything he left her being pried away by lies. Why are you helping me, Frank? After everything? Because it is the right thing to do, he said. Then quieter, and because I never stopped caring what happens to you, whatever answer you gave me 2 years back. Jane's breath caught just slightly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then she turned back to her scattered instruments, and the moment passed, but not before Frank saw her hand was not quite steady as she picked up a pair of forceps and set them carefully aside. If I am to fight this, she said, I will need proof that the hearing is fraudulent from the ground up. My father's will, the terms of the trust, whatever records exist of Whitfield's dealings. Some of that will be in the land office at Salina. Some may require a trip to Junction City, where I understand Dr. Snow keeps his practice, if practice is even the word for it. Then we had better start riding, Frank said, because Whitfield's man Judd does not strike me as someone inclined to wait patiently for a judge's calendar to clear. They left for Salina the following morning, a full day's ride northeast along the Smoky Hill River under a sky so clear and blue it seemed to mock the danger gathering beneath it. The prairie in early autumn was a sea of gold, the big bluestem grass standing shoulder-high in places, dry and rustling in a wind that carried the scent of dust and distant wood smoke from some farmer's burning stubble field. They rode mostly in silence at first, 2 people carefully rebuilding a bridge that had been burned 2 years before, testing each plank before trusting their weight to it. But silence between them had never been uncomfortable, not even at the worst of their parting, and by mid-afternoon Jane had begun pointing out wildflowers and naming the various grasses with the same precision she used to describe a patient's symptoms. And Frank found himself laughing for the first time in days at her dry observation that sunflowers were nature's way of proving that even weeds could be ambitious. You have not changed, he said, as they made camp that evening beside a stand of cottonwoods near the river. Neither have you, Jane replied, which I mean partly as a compliment and partly as an accusation. You are still entirely too willing to throw yourself into danger for people who have not asked you to. You threw yourself under a wagon wheel yesterday for a man you had never met. That is different. I'm a doctor. It is my calling to run toward the wounded. And it is my calling to run toward the people I care about, Frank said, before he had fully considered the words, and then looked away quickly into the fire, feeling his ears heat despite the cool evening air. Jane did not answer right away. When she did, her voice was softer than he had heard it in a long time. I have thought of you, you know, more than I intended to. Riding these 2 years from one town with no doctor to the next, treating strangers who will forget my name within a season, I have thought more than once of a certain sheriff in Ellsworth who never once made me feel as though my work made me less of a woman in his eyes. Frank's chest tightened. Then why did you say no, Jane? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when she spoke, her words came slow and careful, like a physician choosing which truth a patient could bear to hear. Because I have seen what happens to women who marry, Frank, even good men, even men who mean well. The law does not care how kind a husband is. A married woman cannot sign a contract, cannot hold property in her own name in most territories, cannot practice a profession without her husband's consent standing behind every decision like a shadow. I fought too hard, watched my own mother waste away wanting a life she was never permitted to have, to risk becoming a shadow of myself for anyone, even for you. I never asked you to be a shadow. I know you did not mean to ask it. But the law would have asked it for you, whether either of us wished it or not. She looked up at him then, firelight catching the gray of her eyes. That has not changed, Frank. Whatever I feel sitting here with you now, that has not changed. Frank absorbed this in silence, the old hurt mixing with a new, more complicated ache, the sense of a door not entirely closed but not yet open either. Then we had better focus on saving what is yours to keep, he said finally, before we worry about anything else. Jane's grateful smile in the firelight told him he had said the right thing, even if it cost him something to say it. Selina proved fruitful. The county land office clerk, a nervous, ink-stained little man named Prout, at first refused to produce records concerning the Monroe Trust, citing client confidentiality, until Jane pointed out, with the particular steel she reserved for men trying to obstruct her, that as the ward named in the trust she had every legal right to inspect documents concerning her own inheritance, and that the sheriff standing beside her would be happy to explain to the county commissioners exactly why Mr. Prout was so reluctant to allow it. What they found made Frank's blood run cold. The original terms of Charles Monroe's will, properly filed and witnessed, stated plainly that the trust would dissolve entirely upon Jane's 28th birthday, transferring full ownership of the land to her outright, with no provision for extension except in the case of a formal competency finding by the probate court itself, not by any private physician's letter. But clipped to the file was a more recent document, dated only 3 weeks earlier, purporting to be a codicil signed by Charles Monroe extending Whitfield's trusteeship indefinitely in the event of, the exact phrase, any question arising as to the ward's mental or moral fitness. "My father has been dead for 2 years, Jane said, her voice flat with fury as she stared at the paper. This codicil is dated as though he wrote it 3 weeks ago. This is forgery, plain as day." "Forgery is a hanging offense in this territory," Frank said grimly, "or close enough to it. We will need an expert to compare the signature, but I would wager my badge that this was drawn up by whoever is helping Whitfield, maybe even by Judd himself." Prout, sweating now under Frank's stare, admitted in a stammering rush that the codicil had been delivered by a writer some 3 weeks past, a man matching Judd's description, along with a considerable sum of money that Prout insisted, unconvincingly, was merely a filing fee. They left Selina with copies of both documents and a signed statement from the reluctant clerk, riding back toward Ellsworth with the sense that the ground beneath Whitfield's scheme had begun, at last, to shift. They should have known such a small victory would not go unanswered. 2 days after their return to Ellsworth, word came that little Tommy Hanson, the 6-year-old son of a widow farming a homestead 12 miles southwest along Clear Creek, had taken a fever that would not break. Jane packed her salvaged medical bag without hesitation, and Frank, unwilling to let her ride out alone with Judd's men prowling the county, saddled up to accompany her. The day had dawned clear and unnaturally still, the kind of breathless September heat that old-timers on the prairie regarded with suspicion, when the grass stood dry as tinder and the wind held its breath before turning. They reached the Hanson homestead by mid-morning, a small soddy barn tucked against a low rise, surrounded on all sides by the tall, sun-bleached grass of late summer. Jane worked over the boy for hours, sponging his fevered skin, coaxing willow bark tea past his cracked lips, murmuring reassurances to his terrified mother in the same steady voice Frank had heard her use on grown men bleeding from gunshot wounds. By mid-afternoon the fever had begun at last to break, and Jane allowed herself a rare moment of visible relief, brushing damp hair back from the sleeping child's forehead. It was Frank, stepping outside to water the horses, who first smelled the smoke. At first he told himself it was only some farmer burning stubble a few miles off, a common enough sight in September. But when he turned to look southwest, toward the direction of Ellsworth, his stomach dropped. A wall of gray smoke was rising along the horizon, low and wide, moving with a speed that no controlled burn should have, driven by a wind that had, in the last quarter hour, sprung up out of nowhere and was now gusting hard and hot straight toward the Hanson homestead. Jane. He was through the door in 2 strides. Jane, there is a prairie fire coming, and it is coming fast. She was at the window in an instant, her doctor's calm cracking for just a moment at the sight of that advancing gray wall, already close enough now to show the angry orange flicker at its base, close enough that the smell of burning grass had begun to sting the air even inside the soddy. "Mrs. Hanson, is there a creek near here? A plowed field? Anything with bare earth we can reach?" Jane's voice was sharp and fast now, the voice of someone assessing a battlefield. "The creek is a mile east," the widow said, her voice shaking as she gathered her son, still weak with fever, into her arms. "There is a ford shallow enough to cross on foot." "That is against the wind," Frank said, already calculating. "We will never outrun it going east if this wind holds. We need the creek to our backs and something between us and that fire now." There was no time for a wagon. Frank threw Mrs. Hanson and the fevered boy up onto his own horse, told her to ride hard for the creek and not look back, and turned to find Jane already swinging up onto her own mount, her black bag lashed hastily behind the saddle. "Go with them," she said. "I have to gather what I can of my instruments. I cannot replace them again, not with weeks until the hearing. Jane, there is no time for that. There is time enough. Go, Frank, see them safely to the creek. I will follow directly behind you." She was already turning her horse back toward the soddy before he could argue further, and Frank cursed under his breath and spurred after Mrs. Hanson and the boy, torn between 2 duties, trusting that Jane, of all people, understood the danger she was courting. He should have known better than to trust her stubbornness over the fire's speed. By the time he had gotten Mrs. Hanson and Tommy safely across the shallow ford and into the wet mud of the creek bank, the wind had shifted again, swinging the fire's advance directly across the low rise toward the homestead itself, moving now at a terrifying gallop through the dry grass, throwing embers 100 feet ahead of its own line. Through the thickening smoke, Frank could just make out the shape of Jane's horse rearing in panic outside the soddy, the animal bolting in blind terror from the wall of flame and smoke bearing down, leaving Jane on foot, alone, cut off from the creek by a rapidly closing curtain of fire. Frank did not think. He turned his horse straight back into the smoke. "Frank, no, Mrs. Hanson's scream followed him, but he was already gone, driving his horse hard along the only strip of unburned grass still open, a narrow corridor between 2 arms of the advancing fire that was closing even as he rode through it. Smoke tore at his throat and stung tears from his eyes. Embers stung his face and hands like hornets. The heat rolled over him in waves that made his horse scream and fight the bit, but he held the animal to its course through sheer stubborn will, calling Jane's name into the roaring dark. He found her stumbling through smoke near the barn, one arm thrown up over her face, coughing violently, her skirts already smoldering at the hem where an ember had caught. She had her black bag clutched to her chest like a talisman even now, and for one furious, terrified instant Frank wanted to shout at her for risking her life over a satchel of bottles and steel. Instead he swept down from the saddle, one arm hooking around her waist, hauling her up in front of him with a strength born of pure terror, and turned his horse back the way he had come, praying the corridor of unburned grass had not yet closed. It had narrowed to almost nothing. Flame licked at both sides now, close enough that Frank felt the hair on his arms curling from the heat, close enough that Jane buried her face against his chest, and he felt her whole body shaking, not with fear alone but with the strain of breathing through smoke thick enough to choke a chimney. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar. "Hold on to me and do not let go, whatever happens." Her arms locked around him with the desperate strength of someone who had faced death calmly 100 times over in her surgery, and found this, somehow, far worse, because this time there was no bag of instruments that could save her. The horse screamed and lunged forward through a gap that could not have been more than 10 feet wide, flame roaring on either side close enough to singe the animal's flanks, And for one endless heartbeat Frank thought they would not make it through, that the fire would close over them like water over a drowning man. Then they burst through into open, blessedly unburned grass on the far side, the horse running flat out now with the last of its strength. And behind them the two arms of fire met with a great roar and became one solid wall, exactly where they had been standing a moment before. They did not stop until they reached the creek, until the horse, lathered and trembling, finally slowed to a stumbling walk in the cool mud of the ford. And only then did Frank realize he was shaking as badly as Jane was, both of them coughing smoke from raw throats, both of them alive by a margin so thin it left him light-headed. He slid down from the saddle and lifted her down after him, and the moment her feet touched the ground her legs buckled, and he caught her, both of them sinking together into the shallow water of the creek, past caring about wet clothes or dignity, caring only that they were both, impossibly, still breathing. "You could have died," Frank said, his voice raw, cupping her soot-streaked face in both hands, needing to see her eyes, needing proof she was truly there. "For a bag of bottles and needles, Jane, you could have died." "That bag holds everything I have left to practice my calling with," she said, but her voice was thick with tears now, the composed doctor's mask finally, completely cracked open. "And you rode into a wildfire for me, Frank Fairchild, after everything. After I turned you away and broke your heart, and you had every right to let me manage my own foolish choices." "I will always ride into fire for you," he said, and it came out rough and certain and entirely without calculation, the truest thing he had said in 2 years. "I do not care what answer you gave me before. I do not care what the law says a husband can and cannot ask of a wife. I only know I could not draw one more breath in this world if that fire had taken you, and no amount of pride or caution is worth pretending otherwise any longer." Jane made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and then she was kissing him, or he was kissing her. Neither of them could have said afterward who moved first. Only that 2 years of careful distance dissolved in an instant against the smoke-stained afternoon air, her hands fisted in his shirt, his arms around her as though he might never let the world take her from him again. When they finally drew apart, both of them breathless for reasons that had nothing to do with smoke, Jane rested her forehead against his and let out a shaky laugh. "Mrs. Hanson is going to have quite a story to tell about the sheriff of Ellsworth." "Let her tell it," Frank said, and kissed her again, softer this time, savoring it. Mrs. Hanson and Tommy, both safe on the far side of the creek where the fire could not reach, watched the reunion with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had suspected romance was afoot from the moment the sheriff had ridden in beside the lady doctor. The Hanson homestead did not survive the fire, though the family did, and in the following days it emerged that the blaze had begun not from any farmer's careless burn, but from a deliberately set line of fire along the dry grass west of the property. A fact confirmed when a passing drover reported seeing a lone rider matching Silas Judd's description leaving the area at a hard gallop shortly before the smoke was first spotted. Whether Judd had meant to flush Jane out into the open where his men could take her, or simply meant to ensure a fatal accident that would end the matter of the competency hearing permanently, Frank could not say for certain, but the attempt itself, deliberate and murderous, transformed the entire nature of the fight. "This is no longer merely a matter of forged papers and a greedy trustee," Frank told Jane grimly, as they rode back into Ellsworth 2 days later, the widow Hanson and her son safely relocated to stay with relatives in town. "Attempted murder changes everything. Whitfield and Judd have moved past fraud into something a great deal darker, and that means I cannot simply investigate quietly and hope the Board of Trade looks the other way. I am going to need real evidence, evidence that will hold up not just before some circuit Judge Whitfield may have already bought, but before a territorial court that has no reason to favor either side. That evidence, Jane reasoned, would most likely be found in Junction City, where the mysterious Dr. Reginald Snow, one of the two physicians who had signed the fraudulent competency letters, kept his practice. If they could prove Snow had never actually examined Jane, had perhaps never even met her, the entire foundation of Whitfield's petition would collapse. Cornelius Vance and Mayor Dunbar, when they learned of Frank's intention to travel to Junction City on what they termed personal business rather than sheriff's business, made their displeasure known in no uncertain terms. "You are supposed to be keeping the peace in this town, Frank, not gallivanting across the county playing knight-errant for a woman who has already caused this town nothing but trouble," Vance snapped, cornering Frank outside the office. "Whitfield's lawyer tells me you interfered with the lawful service of legal papers. That is grounds for the council to reconsider your position, badge or no badge." "Then reconsider it," Frank said, surprising himself with how easily the words came. "I did not take this badge to help wealthy men steal land from an orphaned woman by paying doctors to lie about her mind. If keeping this job means looking the other way while that happens, I do not want it." Vance's face darkened. "You will regret that, Fairchild." "Maybe so," Frank said, "but I will not regret it half so much as I would regret standing by while Jane Monroe loses everything her father left her, because I was too worried about my own salary to do what is right." He rode for Junction City the next morning, Jane at his side, both of them fully aware now that the line between Frank's duty as sheriff and his loyalty to Jane had blurred past any hope of separating the two, and that whatever came of this fight, his career in Ellsworth might not survive it. Junction City, sitting at the confluence of the Smoky Hill and Republican rivers where they joined to form the Kansas River, was a busier town than Salina, full of soldiers from nearby Fort Riley and the bustle of the Kansas Pacific's eastern terminus works. Dr. Reginald Snow's office, when they found it, turned out to be little more than a single dusty room above a druggist's shop, and Snow himself, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the unmistakable smell of whiskey on his breath despite the early hour, blanched visibly at the sight of Frank's badge. "I have never treated Miss Monroe," he admitted within minutes of Jane's calm, relentless questioning, his hands shaking as he poured himself a drink he did not offer to share. "Mr. Judd came to me some 6 weeks back with a letter already drafted, needing only my signature and $200 besides. I am not a wealthy man, Sheriff. The offer was, I confess, more than I could refuse." "You will put that confession in writing," Frank said, "and you will sign it before witnesses, or I will see to it personally that the Territorial Medical Board hears about a doctor selling his signature to condemn a woman he has never met." Snow signed without further argument, his hand trembling so badly the ink blotted twice. It was the second signed confession they needed, along with the forged codicil from Salina, to build a case that no honest judge could ignore. But even as they left Junction City with the precious document folded safely inside Frank's coat, a telegraph clerk flagged them down at the depot with an urgent message that had come through only that morning, addressed to the sheriff of Ellsworth and marked most urgent. The message was from Deputy Sheriff Owen Pratt, left in charge back in Ellsworth, and it read simply, "JUDD's men took Amos Kellman from his ranch stop, taking HIM across the Smoky Hill to meet WHITFILD, and a Circuit Judge A.T. Cottonwood crossing stop hearing to be held there tomorrow without proper notice. Stop river running high from rains upstream. Stop come quick." Jane's face went white. "Amos Kellerman worked for my father for 15 years. He was there the day my father signed his true will. If Whitfield has taken him to testify falsely or to prevent him testifying truthfully at all, then we ride for Cottonwood Crossing tonight," Frank said grimly, "and we pray we are not too late." They rode through the night and into the following dawn, pushing their horses as hard as prudence allowed, following the twisting course of the Smoky Hill River westward under a sky brilliant with stars, and later, streaked with the pale gold of early morning. The fair weather that had blessed the whole autumn held even now, clear and calm, though upstream somewhere heavy rains had evidently fallen in the past days, for the river beside them ran swollen and brown and fast, higher than Frank had ever seen it, tearing at its banks with a low, constant roar. They reached Cottonwood Crossing, a narrow ford spanned by a rough plank and rope bridge built some years back by local ranchers, just as the sun cleared the horizon, and found exactly the scene the telegraph had warned of. A small group of men stood on the far bank beside a canvas-covered wagon. Elias Whitfield himself, a heavy-set man in an expensive coat entirely wrong for the frontier, Silas Judd beside him, a circuit judge Frank did not recognize looking deeply uncomfortable, and bound at the wrists and clearly frightened, an elderly rancher Frank guessed must be Amos Kellerman. "That is far enough, Sheriff," Judd called across the rushing water, his rifle already raised. "This is a legal proceeding, properly convened, and you have no jurisdiction on this side of the river." "You kidnapped a witness." "Judd, that is not a legal proceeding, that is a crime," Frank shouted back, and beside him Jane was already spurring her horse onto the near end of the bridge, evidently having decided that arguing across a river accomplished nothing while Amos Kellerman remained a prisoner. "Jane, wait," but she was already moving, and Frank had no choice but to follow her onto the swaying, rain-slicked planks of the old bridge, the river roaring furiously beneath them, close enough now that Frank could see the current tearing whole clumps of grass and small branches downstream at a terrifying pace. They were perhaps a third of the way across when the first shot rang out from the far bank, not aimed to kill, Frank realized in the same instant, but aimed at the ropes anchoring the bridge's far end. The old rope, already strained by the flood-swollen river, parted with a crack like a whip, and the entire structure lurched violently sideways, throwing both riders hard against the remaining rail. "They mean to drop the whole bridge," Frank shouted, fighting to keep his footing on the tilting planks. "Jane, go back now. Amos will drown if that wagon goes into the water with him bound like that." Jane shouted back, already scrambling forward across the increasingly precarious bridge on foot, having abandoned her horse's saddle the instant the structure began to give way. A second shot cracked the far anchor rope entirely, and the bridge dropped several feet all at once, planks splintering away into the churning brown water below, until only a narrow section remained, swaying wildly, held by nothing more than a single fraying rope on the near side and the desperate grip of the two people now stranded upon it. Frank saw Whitfield on the far bank shouting something at Judd, his face contorted with something that might almost have been alarm, as though even he had not intended quite this much violence. But Judd, cold and methodical, was already drawing a knife toward the last rope. "Judd, if that rope goes, she dies with it." Frank bellowed across the water, but the enforcer's face showed no flicker of hesitation, and Frank understood in that terrible instant that Judd had never intended for either of them to survive to testify. There was no time to reach solid ground. The remaining planks were already tearing loose beneath their combined weight, the whole structure canting sideways toward the raging current. Frank did the only thing he could think to do. He unlooped the coil of rope he always carried lashed to his saddle, the same rope he had used a dozen times to pull stuck wagons from mud or lower supplies down steep riverbanks, and flung one end across the gap toward Jane even as the planks between them groaned and gave way entirely. "Catch it and hold on, Jane, hold on with everything you have." She caught it. For one heart-stopping instant she was suspended over the roaring brown water as the last of the bridge collapsed beneath her feet, her whole weight swinging out over the current. And then Frank was hauling backward with every ounce of strength in his body, digging his boot heels into the muddy bank, his shoulder screaming with the strain, dragging her hand over hand back toward solid ground while the river tore at her skirts and boots, trying to claim her. On the far bank, Judd's knife found the last anchor rope of what remained of the bridge, and the final section, along with the abandoned wagon, and Frank saw with a surge of fresh horror, Amos Kellerman still bound within it, lurched toward the water. The wagon! Jane screamed, even as Frank hauled her the last few feet onto solid earth, both of them collapsing in the mud, soaked and gasping. But the wagon's plunge was arrested at the last instant by the circuit judge himself, of all people, who threw his own weight against the wagon's tongue and shouted for the horses to be cut free. And in the chaos that followed, with Whitfield shouting contradictory orders, and Judd realizing too late that his violence had gone further than even his employer wished to witness, Amos Kellerman was hauled to safety on the far bank, shaken but alive. Frank pulled Jane fully into his arms on the muddy near bank, both of them soaked to the skin and trembling, the roar of the river still thundering beside them, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, simply held on, grateful beyond words for the solid ground beneath them and the rope, ordinary and unglamorous, that had made all the difference between life and the merciless current. "I am done letting you nearly die for me," Frank said finally, his voice rough, and then apologizing for having saved you as though it were an imposition. "And I am done pretending I do not need saving sometimes," Jane answered, equally rough. "So long as you understand, I will keep right on running toward danger when someone needs my hands, fire or flood or anything else, and you will simply have to trust that I know my own work well enough to weigh the risk." "I trust you completely," Frank said. "I only ask that you trust me to come after you when the risk turns against you." "That," Jane said, managing a shaky, exhausted smile, "I believe I can agree to." Across the raging river, with no bridge left standing between them, Whitfield's party found themselves effectively marooned from Frank and Jane, at least until a safer crossing could be found some miles downstream. But Amos Kellerman, safe now and furious at having been dragged from his ranch at gunpoint, had begun shouting across the water himself, his voice carrying clearly over the current. "I will tell the truth to any judge who asks me, Whitfield, do you hear me? Charles Monroe's true will left everything outright to his daughter at 8 and 20. No conditions, no codicils. I witnessed it myself, and I will say so before God and any court in this territory, whatever threats your man makes against me." The circuit judge, a Judge Harmon Bell, who had clearly begun the day under the impression he was overseeing a routine competency matter, and had instead witnessed an attempted murder and a kidnapped witness, was already regarding Whitfield with an expression of deep and growing suspicion. "Mr. Whitfield," Frank heard him say across the water, his voice carrying with the particular authority of a man who had just realized his reputation was at stake, "I believe we will be continuing this matter in Ellsworth, before a full panel, and I will personally be requesting the Territorial Marshal's office look into the conduct of your associate with that rifle." It took 2 more days to arrange a proper crossing downstream and for all parties to reconvene in Ellsworth, days during which Whitfield, sensing the tide turning against him, attempted first to flee toward Kansas City and then, failing that, attempted to buy Judge Bell's silence outright. An offer the judge, now thoroughly disgusted with the entire scheme, reported immediately to Frank. The formal hearing, when it finally convened in the Ellsworth courthouse on a bright, ordinary Tuesday morning, drew half the town as spectators, curious to see the lady doctor's fate decided at last. Cornelius Vance and Mayor Dunbar sat near the back, their faces carefully neutral, though Frank noted with grim satisfaction that neither man dared meet his eye. Jane herself testified first, calm and precise as ever, laying out for Judge Bell the timeline of her father's death, the terms of his will, and the sudden appearance of the forged codicil. Then came Amos Kellerman, describing in plain, unshakable terms the true will he had witnessed years before, and the day Sela's Judd's men had dragged him from his ranch at gunpoint. Dr. Snow's written confession was read into the record, along with the Salina land clerk's sworn statement about the codicil's suspicious late filing. Frank testified to the deliberately set prairie fire and the collapsed bridge, both of which, he pointed out, constituted a pattern of violence entirely inconsistent with a mere legal disagreement over trusteeship. Elias Whitfield, given the chance to answer these charges, blustered and blamed Judd for exceeding his instructions, insisting he had never ordered violence, only the peaceful service of legal papers. It was a claim that grew considerably less credible when Judd himself, arrested 2 days prior and facing charges of attempted murder that no amount of Whitfield's money could quietly resolve, chose to testify against his former employer in exchange for leniency, describing in flat, unemotional detail exactly how much Whitfield had known and approved. Judge Bell did not take long to render his decision. The forged codicil was declared void and struck from the record. Elias Whitfield was found to have committed fraud against his ward, and the trusteeship was terminated immediately and completely, with full ownership of Charles Monroe's land, some 6,000 acres along the Smoky Hill River, restored outright to Jane Monroe, 2 years earlier than even her father's original will had specified, given the demonstrated malfeasance of her trustee. Whitfield himself was bound over for trial on charges of fraud and conspiracy, alongside Silas Judd, who faced the far more serious charge of attempted murder. When the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Jane sat very still for a long moment, as though she could not quite believe the fight was truly over, before turning to find Frank's eyes across the room, and the smile that broke across her face was worth every mile they had ridden and every danger they had faced to reach this moment. In the days that followed, Ellsworth buzzed with the scandal of it all, and Frank found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, still wearing his badge. Cornelius Vance and Mayor Dunbar, their own dealings with Whitfield now uncomfortably public knowledge, judged it wiser to make peace with their sheriff than to risk further exposure. And Vance himself, in a conversation notable for how much it clearly cost his pride, admitted to Frank that perhaps the town owed him an apology for doubting his judgment. "I do not need your apology, Cornelius," Frank told him, "but I will tell you plainly that if I ever again see this council pressuring an officer of the law to look away from injustice because it is profitable, I will not merely refuse quietly. I will make certain the whole territory hears of it." Vance, wisely, did not argue the point. But even as the immediate danger passed and the legal machinery ground toward its final resolution, Frank found himself facing a quieter, more personal reckoning. Jane Monroe was, at last, a woman of independent means, sole owner of 6,000 acres of prime Kansas grazing land along a river that would only grow more valuable as the railroad expanded westward. She could, if she chose, settle down at last, build a proper house, perhaps even open a permanent practice with none of the uncertainty that had defined her circuit riding life these past years. He found her a week after the hearing, sitting on the porch of the small house in town where she had been staying, going through a stack of correspondence with the particular focus she brought to everything, and something in her expression, thoughtful and slightly troubled, made him hesitate before approaching. "You are thinking of something that does not sit easy," he observed, settling onto the step beside her. "I have had 3 separate offers this week to purchase my father's land, Frank. Substantial offers, more money than I would know entirely what to do with. And I keep thinking of all the towns I have ridden through these past 2 years with no doctor at all, homesteads a full day's ride from the nearest medicine, children who died of fevers that a physician might have caught in time if only someone had been there to look." She set the letters aside, meeting his eyes. "I do not think I want to become a landowner tending cattle and collecting rent, Frank. I think I want to keep riding this frontier and doing the work I was trained for. But I find I do not particularly want to keep doing it alone anymore either." Frank's heart began to pound in a way that had nothing to do with danger. "What are you saying, Jane?" "I am saying that I have spent 2 years telling myself that loving a man and keeping my own name on my own life's work were impossible to hold together at once. And I have spent these past weeks watching you ride through fire and flood without once asking me to be anything other than exactly who I am. You have never once tried to fence me in, Frank Fairchild, not even when it would have been easier for you if you had. I would sooner cut off my own hand than try to make you smaller than you are, Frank said. I fell in love with the whole of you, Jane, the parts that terrify me included. Then I am saying, Jane continued, her composed voice trembling now with something that was equal parts fear and hope, that I do not wish to sell my father's land, but I do not wish to settle on it either, not yet. I wish to lease the grazing rights to a rancher I trust, use the income to properly stock a traveling surgery, and continue riding this circuit as I always have, treating whoever needs treating, wherever they are found. And I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I would very much like a husband riding beside me who would not ask me to become anyone other than who I already am. Frank could not have stopped his smile if he had tried. Are you asking me to marry you, Dr. Monroe? I believe I am, Sheriff Fairchild, though I confess it is a wildly unconventional proposal by any standard, and I would understand entirely if you found it too unorthodox to accept. I have been the sheriff of a cattle town for 3 years, Frank said, laughing now, pulling her into his arms with a joy so complete it nearly ached. I have arrested drunk cowhands, faced down stampeding cattle, and ridden through a wildfire that nearly cooked me alive. I believe I can manage an unconventional marriage, Jane Monroe, if it means I get to spend my life beside the finest, bravest woman this frontier has ever produced. She kissed him then, out on the open porch where half the town might see, and neither of them cared in the slightest, and when they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, Jane rested her forehead against his the way she had beside that smoke-stained creek weeks before, as though she could not get close enough. There is one more matter, she said, regarding your badge. I have been thinking on that, Frank admitted. Vance and Dunbar will keep their word for a season out of fear of scandal, but I do not much fancy spending the rest of my days wondering when the next wealthy man will decide the law is for sale. I have a deputy, Owen Pratt, steady and honest, who has more than earned the chance to wear this star himself. I find, strange as it sounds, that I am rather more interested in riding beside a traveling doctor than in keeping the peace in one town for the rest of my natural life. You would give up being sheriff, for me. Not merely for you, Frank said, though that reason alone would suffice. I would give it up because I find I want an entirely different sort of life than the one I have been living, one with more sky in it, and more of you. They were married 3 weeks later, on a clear October morning with the last of autumn's gold still clinging to the cottonwoods along the Smoky Hill, in a small ceremony attended by Amos Kellerman, the widow Hanson and her fully recovered son Tommy, Deputy-turned-Sheriff Owen Pratt looking uncomfortably proud in a borrowed coat, and half the town of Ellsworth besides, curious as ever but this time smiling rather than gossiping. Elias Whitfield awaited trial in the territorial jail at Topeka, and Silas Judd alongside him, their scheme thoroughly and publicly dismantled, and the 6,000 acres of grazing land along the river had already been leased to a trustworthy rancher recommended by Amos Kellerman himself. The income earmarked to fund a proper traveling surgery, complete with a sturdy new wagon fitted out with cabinets and drawers for instruments and medicines, built to Jane's exact specifications. On the morning after their wedding, they loaded that new wagon with Jane's carefully replenished stores, hitched a strong, steady team, and rode out of Ellsworth together, not toward any single destination but simply westward, following the rumor of a homestead settlement 3 days' ride distant that had gone an entire year without seeing a doctor of any kind. Any regrets, Mrs. Fairchild? Frank asked, glancing sideways at his wife as the town fell away behind them, and the wide gold prairie opened up ahead, endless and inviting under a sky of impossible blue. Jane considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to any diagnosis, then smiled, reaching over to take his hand where it rested on the wagon seat. "Only that we did not do this sooner, Sheriff," she said, though the badge was gone now, tucked away in a drawer back in Ellsworth for whoever might need it next. Only that. They rode on together into the autumn light, two stubborn, capable people who had each nearly lost everything, who had ridden through fire and flood and found, against every hard-earned caution either of them had carried, that love need not mean losing yourself, only finding someone willing to ride beside you through whatever the wild country ahead might bring. Behind them lay a town, a badge and a fortune in land, all of it settled, all of it resolved. Ahead lay the open frontier, uncertain and vast, and for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them intended to face it alone.